It's time for the two-man wall, but this week we have a third man in the wall, Miguel Delaney of the Independent, who's going to join us and talk to us about VAR of all things, and also this potential European Super League. And Miguel, I'm going to get straight to it if I can quote Jamie Carragher, and Jamie Carragher's reaction to all of this was, oh, F, expletive, 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 off. And that was in relation to breaking Liverpool and Manchester United among top clubs in talks over bombshell plot to join new FIFA-backed European Premier League. We'll get to Adam Russell presently, but Miguel, this is not good.
Well, I have to say my reaction was similar to Jamie's, although maybe not in the same way, because mine would have been more about like, oh, this again. We've had these threats hanging over football for about 30 years now. They never ultimately followed through because I think really they're used as leverage rather than any concrete proposal. And a key line in the news report I thought was they haven't signed any legally binding documents. And it's, again, as many people have pointed out, it's funny this comes up just as we're getting to crunch period in what the Champions League will in talks about what the Champions League will look like after 2024. So from that, like, I have to say, from that perspective, I'm a little bit just, they're kind of tedious more than anything, these talks about constant breakaways. And it's hard not to just think, dismiss the super clubs in that way and dismiss it as kind of greed and bargaining positions. And that's why I would have a similar response to Jamie, or maybe for a slightly different reason.
Would you be a fan of the concept?
No. I think this is quite a complex debate because I think I've written a lot about this. And one of the issues is that financial disparity in football is pushing the sport to the point where, and you can see it in TV numbers and even some of the debates about pay-per-view, that it's only really a tranche of super clubs that are truly competitive, even allowing for the surprises of this season. And that, this leads into maybe suddenly when it goes like, I mean, if you take last season, which is supposed to be a freak season, Leicester were so high for so long, Wolves were so high for so long, and what happened? Even in a season when so many of the big clubs are suffering problems, the top four were still the four wealthiest clubs in England. So from that perspective, suddenly it becomes desirable to have the wealthiest clubs meet each other more often, just because it's more competitive games rather than kind of what has happened up until now, which is an array of easy beatings, or the problems in Italy, Germany, or Spain, where you've got effectively, or sorry, not Spain, which is a two-country league, but Italy, Germany, and France, which are one-country leagues almost, or sorry, one-team leagues because of how they win, how the same team wins so often. That is an issue, but I mean, for me, the solution to these issues is the greater distribution of wealth, and football is better when there's more competitive balance and more money is spread, so you have more better teams. And like, I mean, the Champions League is probably a better example, the best example of that, in that if you go back 20 years, when it was, we still had big clubs, obviously, but it was more spread. And you could have clubs like Nantes or Dynamo Kiev, which would have real designs and going far in the tournaments and were properly competitive because there wasn't the same financial gap. That, to me, is a more desirable concept than any kind of Super League, which I think would have an element of tedium around it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Adam Russell, you're a Bolton fan. Last night, Bolton drew 3-3 in Barrow. And actually, Bolton's a good example of what can go wrong when you chase the dream. But what do you think of all this?
Well, I think, as Miguel says, it certainly seems like every year or two we come round to these suggestions of how we revamp European football. Miguel, maybe you can shed some light. I don't understand. The Champions League is up for debate as to how the new format will look in 2024. What is the issue with the current Champions League format? It seems to me that it's not broken whatsoever. Every year we have at least one team who surprise us and get far in the competition. Last year, I'm thinking obviously Lyon and Leipzig and teams who have surprised us. And to me, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with the current format. So why is there always these constant changes being suggested to the Champions League?
Well, this is it, and this is a major problem, I think. It is purely about the big clubs moving in ever decreasing circles of greed. I mean, you would ask, well, what's enough for them? They've already managed to maneuver football to the point where they get revenues of far greater level than anyone else, and there's kind of a cycle to this. Like they position it so obviously the prize money from the Champions League. I know the European leagues tried to argue that the solidarity money, which is basically how that pot is distributed to ensure the gap isn't as great, the European leagues, which is the body that, is all the 53 domestic competitions together, they argue that solidarity money should move up to 20%. What actually happened in the last round of negotiations was the big clubs ensured that the solidarity money went down from 8-point-something% to 7-point-something%. I don't have the figures to hand, but that's pretty much it. And that illustrates the problem there. So they've already had the situation where so much more money comes to them. Then obviously the more money you have, the better players you can buy, the more attractive you can be, the more games you win, the more money you bring in. So it is that cycle. So they've already ensured football is in the situation. So why do they have to go even further? Like, when can you say stop?
Yeah, I mean, is there anything that you think? Because to me, it just seems inevitable that at some point we're going to end up with a European Super League format of some type, whether it be this particular proposal or another amalgamation of it. Do you agree that it seems sort of inevitable at the end of the day? Or
I think what is likeliest is that the Champions League becomes closer to that. I think that's the most probable solution, because it's interesting then, like when these stories get leaked and suddenly journalists are putting it to clubs or whatever, or to federations, whatever, suddenly no one wants to own it because no one really wants to go that far. And I think that's why it's always just kind of hung there as a negotiating position that they're interested in, but no one is ever, it feels like no one is ever going to push it the distance. One of the interesting things about this one is that FIFA are involved. And this points to yet another kind of power split in the game, where FIFA have kind of been looking at the amount of money the Champions League brings in and how wealthy UEFA are for the past few years, thinking, we want a bit of that, which was the decision behind its initial World Cup, which is supposed to be held in China next year. Now, there was initially kind of an entente between UEFA and FIFA over that, because FIFA agreed to move it. But it's interesting then that they're involved in these talks. And it'd be interesting also to find out how far these talks go back, because UEFA is obviously livid at the suggestion.
What, in terms of, obviously last week, all the headlines were about Project Big Picture, and we've obviously, Ed Woodward has reportedly come out today and told the Premier League that he still wants to push ahead with plans to revamp the Football League. Where do you think these proposals sort of fit in with that? Are they really related? It just seems to me like coincidental timing for the news reports to be leaked.
I'd say, I mean, the cynical instinct is to think that someone's leaked this connected to Project Big Picture. It's like saying, you've rejected that, well, here's something else on the horizon.
Could be worse.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the way leaks work as well, there's so many people involved in these things that you never know where it's coming from, and it's not necessarily as naked as, someone who badly wants it, trying to, like, it's rarely as simplistic as that. I would think it's relatively coincidental in that regard. But I mean, it'd be interesting, like the fact that Project Big Picture has been knocked back a fair bit, or it's some of its more upper end goals have been knocked back, should I say, is instructive.
Well, I mean, obviously, as Johnny never fails to point out, I'm a long-suffering Bolton fan, so I think some of the support for the EFL clubs that was mentioned in Project Big Picture could actually be quite beneficial, but it's also kind of been swept off the table along with some of the more out there proposals from Project Big Picture, i.e. scrapping the League Cup, for example. So do you think there's any chance that those talks do reopen again soon? And if so, do you think their proposal could take sort of a different format moving forward?
Well, the Premier League are insistent that whatever happens next, their offer is on the table. If any clubs right up the Premier League have difficulties amid COVID, they can go to them, which is interesting, given we could go into November now and a few clubs could have real issues, particularly if there's no solution. It does feel like, as much as potential split in the Premier League, the EFL isn't quite as 100% unified as had initially been made out. I was on a press conference last week where they were pushing their argument for Project Big Picture. And it was interesting that of the 5 clubs they put up, all were clubs that had never been in the Premier League. And bar Preston, you would think, probably will now. Like, I mean, the way it's often put to me about the EFL is there's basically a fault line in the middle of League One. So because above League One, there's basically Championship clubs who, because of the amount of turnover and mobility, can very easily become Premier League clubs. Then you have, and obviously there's a bit of leakage into League One. So you have clubs like Sunderland or Ipswich who would see themselves as clubs with a chance to get into the Premier League. Then there's clubs below that fault line who just would never see it in that regard. And so to them, the idea of a power grab for the super clubs is kind of irrelevant because it doesn't affect them in any way, which is what you can see why the bailout is attractive to them. But I think for everyone else, it's worth a little bit more consideration. But I suppose, as many people have rightly said, this whole thing feels like the first step in an ongoing and maybe protracted negotiation that's going to see some restructuring of English football.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're going to be talking about this in a year, 2 years down the line. I think the COVID situation's obviously accelerated these talks, which I think were inevitable at some point. I think we've known for maybe 3 or 4 years now that the current ownership model in the EFL is not sustainable on its own in terms of the revenue that you can bring in. And particularly in the Championship, me and Johnny have talked about it in the past, the amount of money that clubs are spending on wages in the Championship is 110% of their annual revenues, which obviously in itself is just obviously not sustainable. So it'd be interesting to see, like you say, what happens in the next year or 6 months and where we are a bit further down the line.
Yeah, and you want to talk VAR, Adam, as well. I have to say I don't know. I'm a League of Ireland fan, and I'm really delighted that this just isn't an issue. And apart from maybe goal line technology, I've no interest really in VAR. I'd much prefer the randomness and even wrong decisions. My team, Galway United, were done by a bad decision last night, but it is what it is. The Liverpool offside and that late on in the game, the Henderson goal. I mean, how can you even really say that that's offside? I don't know, Adam. What do you want to talk about VAR anyway?
I mean, like you say, it's just a string of ridiculous decisions so far this season. And one of the things we brought VAR in for was to reduce the amount of controversies surrounding referee decisions, which obviously hasn't worked. But I think, in my opinion, if Pickford's not seeing red for that challenge on Van Dijk, then why do we even have it in the first place? To me, that was exactly the kind of decision that we had VAR brought in for. For you, Miguel, obviously you're kind of more privy to conversations around this. Is there any chance that VAR becomes under review and we possibly, the Premier League looks to go back to how it was before without VAR, or is it very much a case of we're stuck with it and we have to make the best of it?
From everything you hear, it's here to stay. So it's time to lump it. Now, what will happen, I'm very sure of, there'll be constant reviews and reassessments. I must say I'm broadly pro VAR because I think if you can have technology in place and it can minimize especially blatantly unnecessary injustices, why not have it? But it's thrown up a lot of issues, and one of those is that the rules of football are basically suited to humans doing it and a certain acceptance of human error, and suddenly those rules have become a little problematic when you can have the extreme pedantry that technology allows. And with this obviously manifested mostly in
just on that, Miguel, like, how can you know when a pass was actually made? Because there's a by the time the ball touches your foot, there's a movement in to pass the ball. This takes place over, even something as like that is not actually exact. And then when you go to the actual offside, and it's like literally a hair's breadth, or the width of a hair. What's the point in this really? Like, and why are we worrying about it?
Yeah, well, I suppose, again, it just comes in for, I think, what would otherwise be an admirable push for accuracy. But the problem is in that accuracy, rather than actually stop problems, it's almost like created this infinitesimal number of it, like, because you're almost going like further and further down into kind of where it gets smaller and smaller margins. And that's the issue when you have technology for something as objective as, say, an offside line, because it will, by definition, it has to come down to the smallest margin possible. And it's also why stuff like margin of error or daylight wouldn't quite work, because it just moves the problem. You're still going to get into issues of millimeters. So you maybe you have to allow some sort of like, this is where you come into that issue of human error against the pedantry of technology. Maybe you have to allow some issue, like if it requires if it requires line drawing in the first place or whatever, then maybe allow it to go, or allow some sort of margin for error. But it feels like it's a circle. It's very difficult to square right now.
We need to put the power back into the hands of the referee, as they've done in cricket, whereby the umpire will make a decision, and if the team then disagree with that decision, they can send it to be reviewed. But if we're in a case where the margin, it's below a certain margin of error, then they stay with the decision that was originally made by the on-field umpire. I just never thought that with VAR that we'd end up arguing about offside, because like you say, normally we're pretty clear on offside. You can either see it's offside or it's not. Whereas we're arguing over the width of an elbow, or whether we measure it from the shoulder or from the wrist. And to me, we need to put more power back into the hands of the on-field referee, who see it in real time and are there in front of it, rather than sending it upstairs all the time.
I've actually a lot of sympathy for referees and linesmen now, because it's like their job is just far less enjoyable. They've become less relevant, and you can just tell a lot of the time they're not necessarily enjoying the game. But we might move on from VAR to the Champions League. Before we do, Miguel, the Premier League, Star Sports are 5-2 Liverpool now, and Man City are odds-on favourites. But all of a sudden, it doesn't really look like a two-horse race necessarily.
No, I would agree with that. But I think that's one of the issues in football right now, in that what COVID has basically done is it's basically like everything else in life. It's thrown the game askew. So all the kind of normal presumptions and realities are just off kilter, and that applies. I mean, if you think about how the very league started, it's a month late. Teams are coming off different schedules. They weren't allowed to prepare for a normal preseason. So already you have just everything just on a different sort of wavelength, and that is naturally going to lead to surprises, which is leading to these ructions. And while I wouldn't say it's going to be a Leicester season just yet, what I would say is that all the ingredients are there for the most open title race since 2016. At the very least, it's more likely that we'll have a surprise winner this season. And the one thing I feel at the moment, and this applies to the league and the Champions League, it feels like we're almost every single week, our entire kind of perception is getting reset.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Man United are a great example of that. Like,
yeah,
because I've been on talking about them, and I'm actually fed up with talking about them now, because you say something that they contradict wholly a week later, and then they contradict that a week later. And I mean, looking at the PSG game, and obviously the win over Newcastle, which came in the back of like some pretty pants form in the league. Where do you see the Champions League in terms of who might win it this year? And obviously Liverpool's chance greatly hurt by the news about Van Dijk.
Yeah. I'd still have Bayern as favourites. I think they're the most together of all the big clubs. I suppose, I mean, because COVID has badly affected the European clubs much more than the Premier League. With the Premier League TV money, ensured they could have one of their biggest transfer windows ever. And if you look, I think like I can't remember exactly which clubs it was, but it might have been Barca, Real, PSG, Bayern, Juve. I think their net spend was 6 million. Compared to kind of the 1.2 billion spent, 900 million net spend in the Premier League. So if you go through the main clubs, Madrid are gone a bit stale, Barca are gone a bit stale, and obviously had issues with Messi. That's, I think it feels like both have dropped off. City suddenly feel a bit uncertain. There's a lot of talk about whether the squad is a bit sick of Guardiola, or whether he's just kind of, he's so intense that it's one of those things that's going to run its course a little bit. Liverpool, as you say, have the Van Dijk issue. I think Liverpool would be the closest to Bayern if they had a fit Van Dijk. Now everything's up for grabs. Juventus have made this bizarre decision by appointing Pirlo, so that's a complete unknown. So I would think Bayern, but then, I mean, with the Champions League anyway, this is one thing I found almost every season. There's such a gap between the group stage and the knockout stages, and form can transform so much that what happens at the start of the season is almost irrelevant to what happens in March, April. And Bayern
get away with it,
Bayern, an example of that last season. So like it's almost a little bit of a fool's errand to talk about the Champions League now, because you can look very silly. Other than to say the winner will probably once again come from one of the super clubs, but the whole situation could mean it opens up for someone else. I mean, you would say maybe this is Atletico Madrid's year, but it feels like we say that every single season at this point. It always feels like something's falling their way, then it doesn't.
Yeah, they started Bayern. Yeah, so they started Bayern Munich, obviously, and Liverpool away to Ajax 4-6. 4-6 Liverpool, Adam, which many would consider a gift some of the time, but maybe not now.
Well, there's a few that I wanted to talk about here, Miguel. You may or may not know the fool's errands on this show are very much my territory. I tipped up Juventus at the beginning of the season, despite like you say, they are a bit of an unknown with Pirlo. I think their squad is very deep now compared to previous seasons. They brought in Morata on loan, which I think will be a good signing overall in terms of giving them some more of a threat up front. The other one that I thought was an interesting price for Star Sports was 20-1 for Atletico Madrid. Again, got a very deep squad, a lot of attacking players, and obviously Simeone sets them up in a way that they don't lose many games. We also have another market that I wanted to get your opinion on, Miguel, was the number of English teams to qualify for the last 16. Now, the favourite in this is all 4 at 8 to 11. But I was keen to make a case for only 3 qualifying at 13 to 10. But then I've got to pick a team out of the 4 who I don't think will qualify. And at this stage, kind of looking at the group and United's result in Paris last night, that I think actually Liverpool would be, of the 4, the ones potentially least likely to make it out of their group. I don't know if that's something that you've considered.
I'd still back Liverpool, I think. I would have said United. I'd agree with you. I would have said United before last night, but that really transforms the whole group. Actually, I was about to say transforms the group because they've won what you would have considered a write-off in a sense that it's an away game, but at the moment, home and away doesn't seem to really matter that much. I still think the United group is going to be really up for grabs. I mean, PSG could just as easily, especially if they get some of their midfielders back. They didn't really have one last night. They could just as easily come to Old Trafford and flip that on its head.
And either of them could lose it at Leipzig.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that is still, despite last night's result, in fact, maybe even all the more so because of it, the most interesting group in the entire campaign, bar maybe Real Madrid's group. I was actually at the Chelsea game last night, and it was a bit of a strange performance from Chelsea, I have to say, and it points to issues that Lampard has, in that he still hasn't got the balance of his team right. When he goes to attacking, he can't. When he goes to attacking, basically he can't defend, and when he tries to rein that in by tightening up a bit, they just look stale, or they look kind of very limited in attack. And that was the case last night. He obviously tried to shore up by going defensive, or not going defensive, but just making everything that bit more tighter and constrained, and it meant they had very little imagination in attack.
I know you don't want to, but if you had to pick a winner for us, Champions League at this stage, who would you sticking with? Bayern?
Yeah, I'd go with Bayern. Yeah, actually, on that, the loss of Thiago is potentially a bit distorting for them.
I thought about this with Bayern, the potential loss. Obviously, they brought Sane in, but compared to last season's squad, where they had Perisic and Coutinho both on loan and had a few more options from the bench, I'm concerned, particularly if Sane's got glass ankles and will spend all the time injured, whether they've just not quite got the same depth that they had last season to go and make a challenge in the late stages.
Yeah, and also I agree with you there, and also I think Thiago is such a unique player and gives such a different option in the middle of the pitch. I mean, I know he was a little bit in and out for Bayern over the last few years because of his own fitness issues. But when he plays, he's probably the best passing midfielder in Europe in that way, and offers a control that no other club has. So that may be something that's removed from Bayern. But I even allowing for that, I think they're still in the best shape right now. But we'll see how things develop. But yeah, I'll go Bayern.
I think that's one thing as well for Liverpool fans who are fretting. Okay, like Van Dijk is injured, but you've actually a world-class midfielder now, which you didn't have last year. You shouldn't forget that. And the way that they'll play will change a bit. They will have more possession. Salah's in unbelievable form. I think he's in the best form he's been in about 3 years. And I fancy them, Adam, I have to say. I fancy a bet this evening, and I need something to keep me going during the start of these lockdowns. So I'm going to back Liverpool too. As Miguel says, there's no home or away advantage anymore, really. Like you look at Man United going to Paris last night, they might as well have been playing anywhere. It just doesn't really matter.
Yeah, you'd expect probably Fabinho to drop into a centre-half role that we've seen him play reasonably successfully in the first few weeks of the season. I think obviously Ajax have sold a lot of their more talented players. So yeah, I do think Liverpool will get the win tonight.
Do we have anything else for Miguel, the Irish Spaniard?
I wanted to ask Miguel, the last one on the Champions League, about we have a market on the highest scoring teams from the group, which is potentially quite a difficult one to pick. One I picked out at a nice price is Barcelona at 7-1. They've obviously still got Juventus to play, but they're obviously quite a favourable group, and they've already scored 5 last night. So 7-1 for them to be top scorers. What do you think of that? Also, Dortmund at 20-1 and Man City at 7-2, which seems quite short too.
I was about to say Barca purely because they've got, not just because of how they put past 5, but because of who they're playing. If there's a whipping boy in the group, then it kind of distorts things and means teams can kind of rack up goals. I know Ferencvaros, who haven't been in the Champions League for a long time, they could face a few hidings. I mean, we know what Ronaldo's like in those situations. Yeah, and so it's any sort of lopsided group really, and just looking through them now. Because I suppose the tighter the group is, you'd imagine the less goals there are really, because they're going to be that bit cagier. So yeah, I wouldn't disagree with the Barca group.
Yeah, hard to look past Man City as well at 7-2 with Porto, Marseille, and Olympiacos in their group. So you'd expect them to score a few as well.
Yeah, and also I suppose City, even though I don't think they're at the level they were years ago, was like 2 years ago. They're still one of those teams that on the days when they're on it, they can suddenly rack up a high score. In fact, we saw that last season. Even though they finished so far behind Liverpool, pointing to obvious issues, there were still games where they, like say Villa, when they beat them 6-1, they get on it for a period and they're capable of still absolutely trashing a side. So yeah, I'd agree there as well. But I think just maybe it's less of a guarantee because City's fixtures are actually a little bit awkward and they could have there's a potential at least for slips. So I'd go for the Barca group, I think.
Just finally, before you go, how are you finding being a football journalist at the moment and going to games like the Chelsea game last night with no one there?
I feel I've adapted a bit. I mean, I do have to say, actually, people have no sympathy for this really, but the fact we're traveling much less does genuinely make a huge difference to the way you work, to the time you have. Because I mean, being honest, this week rather than being at Chelsea Sevilla, I would have been at Paris Saint-Germain United, which would have meant kind of traveling back today, all of that. Also at the moment, this wasn't the case in so much up until now because the situation wasn't as bad. But at the moment, I'm just staying in London because it would be supposed to be seen as a bit needless to go from London, a tier 2 area, to Liverpool or Manchester when we have correspondence there. So it's about kind of minimizing travel. So I'm doing more games off the TV, traveling less. I'm kind of going to games where we can. But even so next week I was supposed to be at Juventus Barca, which I was really looking forward to for obvious reasons. Yeah. Now Italy is, they brought in quarantine. So that's one side of it. For certain games, your job will have to take a decision. Well, is that worth it for you to go to quarantine for 2 weeks on the way back? Or say another example of that was the Iceland-England game. And I was really looking forward to going to Iceland. I've never been. And even to kind of experience that stadium and all of that. But Iceland brought in a rule where you had to quarantine for 4 days on landing in the country. And most media organizations, just for an obvious reasons, and because it's just a Nations League game, it might be different if it was kind of a decisive qualifier. They didn't pay to send. I think only 3 written media went to Iceland and took the 4 days quarantine to go to the game, and the rest of us stayed in the UK and did it off TV. So from that perspective, it does make the job maybe a little bit less relentless in terms of travel, and means you're kind of closer to normal hours. Because that's one thing about the job. It just, by the very nature of it, you're working all over the place. Or so in normal circumstances, you'd have early trains or early drives or early flights, and then you're working until kind of 1 a.m. the next night because you're at the game. A lot of that is kind of lessened now. So yeah, it has changed it a fair bit in that sense.
Yeah, football's loss is the 2-man walls game this week. So.
Well, this is it. Yeah, a great 3-man wall. Miguel, thanks a million for coming in.
No problem, lads.
Thanks,
and thanks to Adam Russell. And that was the 2-man wall, which is the 3-man wall this week. And we'll be back next week for more.